Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Gray Matter. Well, today we have another distinguished guest on, this time talking about some of the things that are going on in politics and law. Her name is Karen Selick. Karen has had a very long and distinguished career, both as a lawyer and also as a legal journalist, a political legal journalist. And of course, there's a lot going on right now in our country, and has been over the past few years. That not many lawyers or people in the legal community have been willing to comment upon. Karen has a long history of having no compunction about that. And so we're looking forward to talking with her and mining some of her ideas about what's really going on in the legal profession and politically in our country. So before we talk to her and introduce her properly, we're going to go, as we always do, to the aphorisms board. The first one we have is from a lady who I think is one of the greatest British prime ministers of the 20th century, although she's a controversial figure, and that's the Iron Lady, the late Margaret Thatcher, who once famously wrote, "A man or woman's right to think as they will, to spend what they earn, to own property, to have the state as servant and not as master. They are the essence of a free economy, and on that freedom all our other freedoms depend." Secondly, from the famous 20th century economist Friedrich Hayek, perhaps the fact that we have seen millions voting themselves into complete dependence on a tyrant has made our generation understand that to choose one's government is not necessarily to secure freedom. Thirdly, from Joan of Arc, "One life is all we have, and we live it as we believe in living it. But to sacrifice what you are and to live without belief, that is a fate more terrible than dying." So who do we have on the show today? Well, Karen Selick, and she describes herself as an independent journalist, and I'm reading from a biography she has online. She says, "At the end of 2015, I retired as a lawyer after 38 years of practice. For about 24 years, she practiced family law in Belleville, Ontario. She says people still contact her occasionally seeking family law advice, but that's no longer her area of practice. So she says, please seek assistance elsewhere." From 2009 to 2015, she was the litigation director for the Canadian Constitution Foundation, which is known as Freedom's Defense Team. She says she has also been and continued to be a freelance writer for 16 years. She wrote the back page column in Canadian Lawyer magazine. Since then, she's contributed occasionally to a wide variety of other newspapers and magazines, including the Globe and Mail, the National Post, the Ottawa Citizen, the Vancouver Sun, Fraser Forum, and the Freeman. Her subjects are items of current interest, including recent court decisions, and the political philosophy expressed in her writing is called libertarian or classically liberal. And she says she lives in Eastern Ontario with her husband and dogs. Welcome to the program, Karen. Thanks for being with us today on Gray Matter.
Hi, thank you for inviting me.
So the first question I have to ask you is, Canadian Lawyer. Now, I received this publication. Is it only me, or has Canadian Lawyer gone seriously woke? What is going on with Canadian Lawyer?
I haven't read it in years. I stopped writing the back page column, I think, in 2006. And then forget who was that wrote it after me. But since I'm not in practice anymore, they don't send it to me. You know, it's one of those controlled circulation papers. So I haven't been keeping up with what they've done, but it wouldn't surprise me. I mean, a lot of other legal groups have gone seriously woke.
Mm-hmm. Well, I can tell you that I look at it occasionally, and there's nothing. They miss you, because there's very little in that publication that is anything remotely libertarian, let alone conservative. They've swung very, very hard to the left.
Yeah, the person who hired me to write for them died a number of years ago, so heaven knows who they replaced that person.
So this is an interesting question for you. Obviously, you practiced law in Canada for almost 40 years. You've written extensively on the Canadian legal scene and political scene. What do you think is the cause for the shift in media and even in legal publications so hard to the left. What do you think are the main causes for that?
Well, from the mainstream media, I gather it must be that they're being paid by somebody, and you don't bite the hand that feeds you. I am not really up with what's happening at Canadian lawyers, so I don't know. But I actually think a lot of this is peer pressure, and it always has been. There were people that used to write to me when I was writing for the back page of Canadian Lawyer and say, "You are the only page that I turn to, and I read that, and then I throw the magazine away." Because, they thought that even then it was not of much value.
Mm-hmm. Well, I went through and I looked at a website that you still have online, and it contains articles that go back over 30 years.
My collective.
Right. Yeah. So, but what really struck me is that many of the things that you were writing about 25, 30 years ago are so prescient, like they're actually, some of them were prophetic. For example, I found one here from many years ago called "Let Litigants Pick the Judge," and you were expressing here concern about the then conservative government garnering cautious approval when it changed the procedure for selecting Supreme Court of Canada judges, and you went on to talk about some of the concerns about those changes. Do you want to talk about that a little bit? Because obviously this has become really, really important in subsequent years. I'm taxing your memory a little bit, but
I don't remember which changes. Was that just to have the committee talk to them afterwards? Like it has never been up to anybody other than the Prime Minister to decide who gets onto the court, right? Prime Minister and Minister of Justice and their committees. But I think that from that point onwards, it was just we're going to put forth our nominee, and the opposition will have a chance to, talk to them a bit. But I still don't think that that's a huge improvement. It's not like in the US where they can actually prevent somebody from getting on the court, Supreme Court.
Or at least properly vet them in terms of, what their values are. Because, just talking about, for example, recently, you're probably aware our Chief Judge, Justice Wagner, expressed some very strong comments about the Freedom Convoy, the truckers' convoy, that offended many millions of Canadians.
Yeah, I actually wrote an article about that, and I was one of a group. I think there were 13 of us, mostly lawyers, but not all. We actually sent in a complaint to the Canadian Judicial Council.
Yes, I know. I wanted to ask you about that. Do you want to talk about that a little bit, why that was done and how that sort of transpired?
Yeah, well, we have a chat group that most of the 13 are on. And so we were all pretty upset by the stuff that he was saying. It seemed clearly to break with precedent as to what Supreme Court judges talk about. They're not supposed to talk about issues that might eventually come before them as cases. So, it seemed to be totally inappropriate for him to have said what he said. And someone said, well, how about if we file a complaint to the Canadian Judicial Council? Let's just see what they do. Because, of course, the catch here is that he is the head of the Canadian Judicial Council. So he would be the guy who would have to discipline himself, or at least lead the committee that disciplined himself. But we were interested to find out what would happen. So somebody prepared a draft and circulated it, and we made a few changes and then sent it in. And the result was that the person who opened our mail, I guess, who has this, she told us that she has the power to decide what to advance to the committee and what not to advance. And she, in my view, stated a bunch of blatant falsehoods, like, this doesn't concern judicial conduct, she said. Of course, a judge speaking out to the media concerns judicial conduct. How could it not? And she gave us a couple of other reasons why she thought, this was not worthy of advancing. And there's no place to appeal to. But I did find out after I wrote the article about this that several other people had also filed complaints with the council about this. So my observation has been since then that he has kept quiet. I think he may have sort of got the message that people are complaining about you, even though she purports not to have actually advanced the message, advanced the complaint up the line. I think she must have made it clear to him that, we've received at least 3, and maybe even many more, complaints about what he said in the media, because he hasn't spoken up since. So maybe that was just as good as getting an official reprimand of himself. I'm not sure.
Well, we can only hope. Unfortunately, this sort of foray into judicial activism is not unique. Around the same time, I think, as Chief Justice Wagner made those comments, our former Chief Justice, Beverly McLaughlin, who continues to be in the employ of the CCP over in China on some sort of human rights appeals tribunal, she took the time to write an op-ed that was published. I don't know if you saw this. No. It was expressing basically concern about the right of Canadians to protest, and the nub of her opinion was that really Section 1 of the Charter trumps all, and that it is the effective charter right. That the whole context of charter litigation is flipped from protecting the individual to really being a force for government imposed restrictions. And so, unfortunately, this seems to be a trend, and it's one that you recognized some years ago in your writings. I noticed there was another one here, and this is one that really caught my interest, where you wrote a piece called "Marx or Hayek for the Supreme Court." Do you recall writing this one? And basically, what you were, the nub of it is, the nub of the piece, as I saw it, is that we need to be very, very concerned as Canadians about the values and the political views of the people who we are appointing to the Supreme Court of Canada, because these people have tremendous power. They're lifetime appointments, and they seem to be gravitating towards the idea that their role in society is to make law rather than simply, or I shouldn't say simply, rather than to interpret the Constitution and democratically produced legislation. So what's the idea here with Hayek and Marx?
Well, they're sort of the polar opposites. And in fact, I'm kind of surprised that I chose Hayek, because Hayek, in my view, is a little wishy-washy himself. If you read The Road to Serfdom, he criticizes all kinds of socialist measures all the way through the book. And then at the very end, he sort of gives in on certain things, like in the last chapter. And says, but we still need to have, public education, or something that sort of contradicts the rest of the book. But I just want to go back to Beverly McLaughlin for a minute, because she's an interesting case. And even though I didn't read that particular op-ed, I think I read some headlines or something and didn't have time. But back in 1980 or so, she wrote a fabulous, maybe it was 1990, I don't know, but it was one of those number of years, I think. She wrote a fabulous, I think it was a dissent about a freedom of expression case, in which she was, a real champion of freedom of expression. And then at some time when I was at the CCF, she changed her tune. So I think it was maybe 2003 or so. All of a sudden, she had abandoned all of that, and she was favoring, legislation that restricted free speech. So I don't know what happened to her. I know I wrote a piece about it then, saying, like, where's the Beverly McLaughlin we used to have? Never got an answer, of course. But yeah, she changed her tune, and I think now it may have gotten even worse. And I don't know whether it's, as I said, peer pressure. People want to be popular with the people they work with. They don't. It is difficult to always stand out like a sore thumb. But I find that the more you do, if you're willing to do that, people come out of the woodwork and say, yes, I think so too. They were all afraid to say that until they heard you say it. And then suddenly, if they hear, there was a meme going around at the beginning of the pandemic with, all these people, on their knees, and one guy stands up, and then a whole bunch of others stand up. And the guy with the whip sort of, first he's whipping the ball, and then eventually he's running away. And that does seem to be true. But why there's so much pressure in the judiciary, I'm not sure. I mean, they go to judge college. I know that they do have an institute of judicial education. I don't know whether they're required to go, or how often, or how long, but maybe the pressure there is on them. I don't know what they're taught gets to go there. I've looked into that stuff from one or two times in the past, and they're like, who gets to go to judicial college and teach the judges? And I don't know the answer to that. So the judges are supposed to be very tight-lipped about this, and I think they are.
Well, the other question that you've raised from time to time in your writings is, not only who gets to teach the judges, but who will judge the judges. That's a serious question in this country too, isn't it? Because and your letter that you and some other lawyers wrote in let's say in expressing concern about Chief Justice Wagner, that seems to indicate that there really isn't anybody judging the judges these days.
Well, not for anything like this, and certainly not the top guy. I mean, that was always a concern.
I want to come back to this, and I want to quote you something that you wrote. This is in the context of, Marx or Hayek for the Supreme Court. And here you write something that actually made me giggle a little bit. You said, Karl Marx would indeed have made a lousy judge, but not because he was an ideologue. It's because his ideology stinks. It's patently inimical to human flourishing. Wherever it has been put into practice, it resulted in the widespread impoverishment of the population and the deaths of many innocent victims at the hands of totalitarian despots. All of these results are predictable and inevitable consequences of socialism. And Marx's failure to recognize this, or perhaps to give a damn, seems to show a certain lack of judgment on his part. I would never want to entrust him with making any decisions that could affect people's lives. Unfortunately, it seems that most of the judges that Mr. Lametti has been selecting recently and going back over many years in this country, we're not getting very many libertarian judges, are we, Karen? We seem to be getting more who are of the Marxist school. Now, that's very concerning, and that should be very concerning to most Canadians, shouldn't it?
Yeah, there's first of all, there's so few libertarian lawyers. I'm actually kind of pleased and surprised lately to see how many people have sort of started to come out of the woodwork, because when this whole thing started, there was nobody that wanted to take on this kind of challenge. I mean, there was the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedom, like John Carpay's group, but not many other people. Rocco Galati, to his credit, I'm not a fan of his, but he at least did step up to do that. And if there's not many libertarian lawyers, there's not many libertarian judges. But I was just looking the other day at there's a little chart that you can look at of who's been appointed as a judge recently for the federal appointments. And you can see how many applicants there were and who got appointed. And it's divided into male, female. Then it asks for other things like, disabled or LGBTQ plus, whatever those letters are. And actually these days, the percentage of people who are being appointed from all the pool of candidates who classify themselves as LGBT, whatever, they are getting the highest percentage appointed. The men and women are, I think, maybe roughly equal. I don't recall, but I was going to write a piece about this, saying that if you want to get a judicial appointment from the federal government these days, that's the key. Tick that box on your form, on your application form, and that seems to be like, let's shortlist this person.
It's a little known fact, actually, that one of the first things that the Trudeau government did back in 2015 is they changed the criteria, the screening process for Superior Court judges. And I'm aware of this because it just so happens that my hat was in the ring at that time, and they sent out a new form. And in order to maintain your status as somebody who was in the running, you had to fill out this form, and the forms require you to reveal all sorts of personal data, like what you described. You had to reveal political leanings, all sorts of information that was quite personal. I thought political and really should not be part of the selection criteria at all. And so I refused to complete it, and so I was out of the running. And I don't think that's unique to me. I think that there were probably a number of people, and this may have been the whole point. There are probably a number of people who were in the running, were interested, but when they saw the new selection criteria, said, well, I'm never going to make it up this hill. And that happened in 2015, and that is not very well publicized, but I actually have the questionnaire. I should post it on my website one of these days.
Well, I wonder whether it's been changed again, because I know that with the recent appointment of a new Supreme Court Judge, Michelle Obansawin, I know that I
Yes.
spent a lot of time reading her application for the Supreme Court, and I think it must be a pretty similar form. And I don't recall seeing any questions about political leanings. I mean, certainly she was invited to, describe herself as Aboriginal, and she did, even though I really question how close her connection to the Aboriginal community is. But I'll get into
Yes.
that.
Yes. Well, and really, how relevant is that? I mean, this is an interesting question. And actually, I should tell you, I got into some trouble a few years ago in 2020 because I was actually selected to a board to pick, provincial court judges in Alberta.
Mm-hmm.
And I was picked as a conservative, and I made an online pledge that I was going to pick the best candidates regardless of intersectionality. So if we were picking 6 judges and they were all, and the best 6 candidates were all women, it was going to be all women. Or if they were all black, they'll be all black. Because it's my particular view, and you may disagree with this, that for a position that's as important as judicial office, with so much power to shape the lives of others, we really must have our best, most principled people in those roles, and we shouldn't be picking people based upon whether or not they are vaguely Indigenous or whatever. Really, we're talking about something where the content of a person's character and their knowledge and their ability to make sound decisions is the most important qualification.
I do agree with that, and the thing that the presumption actually that by having people who have these diverse physical characteristics, I'm black or I'm Aboriginal, the presumption is that those people will also have like a monolithic worldview, and that's actually quite false.
Mm-hmm.
I used to write about this and say, take, for example, me and Justice Rosalie Abella, who's on the Supreme Court. We're both Jewish women, but boy, our worldviews ever different.
Mm-hmm.
He was a
one of the terrible things about it too is that if you take the example of someone like Ketanji Jackson, who was just appointed in the United States, here you have an incredibly qualified woman who is, checks all the boxes in terms of somebody who would be and could be considered to hold high judicial office. But her being on the court will always be stained by the fact that President Biden went out ahead of time and said, I'm going to be picking a black woman for the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
And it really is unfair to her. And honestly, and I can tell you, personally, I know your experience is the same. There are so many brilliant and talented women in the legal profession now that honestly, they don't need any help. They're doing great. There's more women going to law school than men now, and I think we're getting close to pretty much equality in terms of the number of judges on the bench. Certainly, the profession. So I mean, these ladies don't need any additional help. That's my view. I mean, they're so talented and so skilled and brilliant on their own. I mean, we have a lot of tremendous judges. And right here in Alberta, our the chief judge of our Court of King's Bench is a woman. She's great. Same with our Court of Appeal. Both very, very brilliant jurists. Anyway, that's just my 2 cents, but I'm not sure if your view is different about that.
When I was looking into Justice Obansawin, because I was going to write about this, and I thought, let's see what I can find out. I was really quite impressed by how productive she was. Like, she wrote a lot of decisions. I know people who've been appointed to other judicial positions who never pick up their pen or never work on the typewriter. I actually stumbled across an article I'd written today about that years ago, where some judges never write anything. They never write a decision. What are they doing? They get all this vacation time and all these days set aside for writing decisions, and they don't write any. And others turn out books every year, and there's no matching it up to male or female or gay or black, or it's an individual thing.
This raises another issue that you've written about that I saw on your let's call it a blog about how about real diversity at the SCC. And here you're raising an important issue. I mean, people talk about diversity, but they talk about diversity in terms of race or gender or sexual orientation or whatever. But as you point out here, really maybe the most important diversity that doesn't seem to be valued is intellectual diversity. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, there might be. What can I say other than I agree with you? But to actually get that to happen seems very unlikely, since judges are appointed by politicians. So other than every time there's a change of government because of an election, Stephen Harper, I think, appointed as many people as he could. There's somebody, Mr. Justice Russell Brown, who used to come to the conferences of the Canadian Constitution Foundation. I think might have even been on our advisory panel at one point. So I would expect him to have, a libertarian viewpoint on things. But if he just is one of 9, I mean, Harper had actually appointed a few more. I think one of them just left recently. I forget who that was. But, that will be, I think you can pretty much guarantee that anybody who goes on the Supreme Court will have the same political philosophy as the person who appoints them. I don't think there's any doubt. So it will, the fact that they stay there for a long time is what saves us. The Harper appointees may still be there. They may be slightly better than all the Liberal appointees. But to tell you the truth, I've looked to see whether Justice Brown has written anything, not recently, but he's hardly ever the author of the Supreme Court judgments. And I don't know what goes on in the back rooms of the Supreme Court. I don't know how they decide. I mean, I have listened to speeches where judges have described how they decide who writes the judgments, but that was 20 years ago, and maybe it's changed.
Karen, do you think that the manner in which judges are compensated in Canada is part of the problem in terms of politicization of the bench?
I saw something today that I wrote on that subject. It was a complicated argument, but they're all paid the same amount, regardless of how productive they are. I made that point. So that's, if somebody has a tendency towards laziness, you can just sort of skate by. I'm not saying that any of our Supreme Court judges are lazy. They couldn't possibly be, because they do so much work. But
right.
I certainly do know some, judges on the federally appointed bench, like Superior Court of Ontario, that I've been before in years gone by, who I consider to be pretty darn lazy. And, they get paid the same amount, whether they're lazy or whether they're not. And, yeah.
Part of the issue, I think, it's easy to look at, the judges in isolation and pick on them, but they really are, the product of a whole system going all the way back into law schools and also in the legal profession. I'll give you an example, and I don't know if you're aware of this because it comes out of Alberta, but in Alberta, the Law Society of Alberta has recently created an Indigenous sensitivity course, a legal education course, and made this mandatory for every single lawyer in Alberta to take. This was, a little bit of an affront to someone like me, who's actually has Indigenous heritage. I'm actually a First Nations person. My grandmother was in residential school. My great-grandfather was a chief. I was involved in a number of Indigenous claims. I have a minor in Canadian Native history. But I did not apply for an exemption. I took the course. I found it to be rife with many historical inaccuracies. I found it to be imbued with a lot of the quote-unquote liberal woke ideology, which is false, particularly surrounding the Sinclair Commission, Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which has been completely distorted in Canada. But there are a number of lawyers, and this is what I want to ask you about, Karen. A furor has been created in Alberta because there are a number of lawyers who resisted taking the training, not because they didn't want to learn about Indigenous issues, but because they took the position the principal position that it is not the place of the law society to be mandating political type legal education for lawyers. In other words, this type of education is ideological. It's doctrinal. It's not having to do with competency and the type of things that the law society is normally concerned about in terms of training and keeping lawyers current in the law. And incidentally, the lawyers who refuse to take the training have now been suspended. I'm curious to know your view on this.
Well, that's quite a price to pay. I agree with what you said. That is, it's not the law society's obligation or place to be pushing any kind of ideology on people. But I gather that course masqueraded as something else, right? They must have said you'll all have to learn about Aboriginal law, and then snuck in something that wasn't really Aboriginal law, because we already did have courses that people would take if they were interested, and certainly it doesn't come up in every case. So people who aren't interested don't have to take Aboriginal cases. So yeah, it's puzzling that they would make it mandatory when people could sort themselves out, just like I'm not interested in real estate, so why would I take a special course in real estate? But then when they sneak in ideology, and of course because you took it, that, and you can say that definitively. I imagine for people who didn't take it, they're still probably they might be complaining that it's ideological, but how can they say definitively if they didn't take it?
Well, I think the concern of some of the lawyers who refuse to take it is that this is a prelude to a kiss. In other words, that or this is a Trojan horse, so that the next round of mandatory training is going to be, for example, in gender sensitivity, or environmental concerns, or things of that nature, so that we'll have a further politicization of the profession, which of course is going to have residual impact upon who goes up to the bench, because of course that's where all the judges come from. They come from a pool of lawyers. So I think that's the concern. Would you agree? You sort of see the slippery slope, or do you think that's an overreaction?
No, I think you're right. I mean, people have been poo-pooing the idea of a slippery slope for years and years and decades and centuries, and here we are. I mean, we're at the culmination now of all these slippery slopes. It's quite astonishing. I remember going to a conference once at the University of Toronto, well after I had graduated, and I was invited to speak on judicial independence then. And somebody who was at that conference was a lawyer or judge from South Africa. And I was astonished to hear, so this is probably about 15 years ago, I was astonished to hear that judges in South Africa were actually required to take some kind of loyalty pledge, which to me was like very, clearly Marxist. And they couldn't, I don't remember whether it was lawyers or judges, so I'm not sure whether lawyers couldn't practice without taking it, or judges couldn't be appointed to the bench without taking it. But it was clearly something that was designed to channel all judicial philosophy into this Marxist channel, because you couldn't carry on if you didn't sign this pledge. I wish I knew the details right now, but I'm just pulling something out of my memory here.
Well, we've been talking a lot about judges, but I'd like to switch gears a little bit and talk about something that's going on in Canada right now that I've actually written about. I know you've written about, and this is the concern about the constant encroachment upon freedom of speech in Canada. You wrote a piece some years ago called Freedom of Speech, RIP. Again, very prescient given what's going on, but seeing what's happening in Canada right now through COVID and the restrictions there, through censorship, the weaponization of social media, now Bill C-11 coming into effect in Canada. Are you still of the view that freedom of speech is in demise in Canada, and is there an antidote? Is there a solution?
I had always hoped that the race would, when the internet allowed everybody in the world to express their opinion and become their own publisher and their own video maker and so on, I had always hoped that that would be the solution, because we'd be able to just bypass the censors or bypass the mainstream. But I'm not as optimistic anymore that we're going to be able to do that. I mean, there are still, what has impressed me through the pandemic is the fight that people have put up. There are so many good people in this fight now, and so many people, putting alternate platforms up when they get censored, and just going to different. Now YouTube censored me, so now I'm on Rumble or BitChute or somewhere else. So it's encouraging, but I'm not sure which side is going to win.
Mm-hmm. Well, and Karen, on that, in that vein, what is your view on recent calls for an amnesty for political decision makers who really caused all of this destruction to be wreaked upon us?
Absolutely.
What's your take on that?
No amnesty. In fact, my take is the absolute opposite. That is, lately, and this is something that I wrote about recently in the Epoch Times, we have been inserting advance amnesties into legislation, saying, nobody will be found liable. No politician, no government employee will be held liable for anything that's done under this law. So there was, just before the pandemic, like in 2019, the Ontario government passed a very broad act called the Crown Liability and Proceedings Act, which contains blanket indemnities against blanket amnesties in advance for anything that they might do under the legislation. And even the Emergencies Act has a section there that says no politician will be responsible, personally liable for any damage that anybody was suffered. It actually says that people who are damaged by the invocation of the Emergencies Act do have a right to compensation, but the compensation is going to be paid by the government, and they'll have to sign off a release. In order to get anything, they'll have to sign a release saying, I release all claims against the government and everybody else. And, there's a section there that specifically says, and, no personal liability for any politician who acted in good faith. Well, I think that's going to be the challenge right now. I mean, all of these people are coming before the inquiry. This week is going to be the politician's turn. Mr. Trudeau is actually going to be coming this week. Did he act in good faith? I mean, I've already made my decision. He couldn't possibly, given all the other evidence that has come out in the inquiry from police, senior police officials saying we didn't need the Emergencies Act in order to clear away the protests. I don't see how he could possibly have acted in good faith. What were his motives? Well, lots of ideas about that, but I don't think amnesty is the right way to go. I think it should be the opposite. I think politicians should have personal responsibility, personal liability to be sued in tort for the damage that they've caused through passing their legislation and through executing, if it's not the politicians, the bureaucrats who execute that legislation that harms people should have to think about it in advance before they do it, because they should be personally liable in tort for damage that they do.
Mm-hmm. It was almost as if they knew what was going to happen in advance. But of course, that's a conspiracy theory, except that it's actually backed up by data. Another one is, and I believe you talked about this in your piece, are these indemnities that governments handed out to pharmaceutical companies, which basically made it open season on the human race, right? Well, yeah. And in fact, the indemnity, actually, the first one for the vaccinations was in the U.S. from 1986. Came out during the Reagan administration because the pharmaceutical companies had been losing a lot of lawsuits when people sued for vaccine injuries. And they collectively took the position that, well, if we keep losing these lawsuits, we can't afford it. We won't make any money. So we won't make vaccines anymore unless you give us this indemnity. And so it was in a 1986 statute. Now, Canada doesn't have a similar statute to that, but we've sort of taken the back door to doing the same thing. We've given the pharmaceutical companies an indemnity so that even if somebody sued them,
and the pharmaceutical companies were found to be liable in a court of law, the government would indemnify them. We would pay off, the taxpayers would pay that bill. It just, the 1986 statute in the US just opened the door for making vaccines, much more so than any other pharmaceutical, because it only covered vaccines on the childhood vaccination list. And those have multiplied. I don't remember what the number was that kids had to have in 1986, but it might have been 5, and now it's like 39 or something. So they've just said, oh, well, geez, no liability here. We'll just concentrate on making this. And they did.
So in terms of holding politicians accountable, that sounds awfully good to me. But my question is, how do you suppose we get there? Do we need to go back and start with full-blown public inquiries into what occurred? For example, you're probably aware Preston Manning is heading up a project right now. It's a privately funded public commission or public inquiry into 16 key questions concerning government's handling of the COVID-19 pandemic. Is that sort of where we start before we can get to a point where we can say, this person or that person, Dr. Tam or whoever, is personally responsible and can be either prosecuted criminally or can be sued civilly for some of the horrendous decisions that they made during the course of the COVID-19 pandemic?
I mean, one of the problems is that really we should have started 100 years ago. So, we should have started by questioning the whole idea of mandatory government-funded education. And, I've questioned it for years because a lot of the damage has come from schools. Schools are basically little brainwashing places where you send your kid every day. So it's difficult to start, with all the brainwashing that has happened and a population that, still believes a lot of what it's told. When the, strong suggestions here in Ontario came out that you start masking now, I see about 50% of the population has done it, and another significant percentage are begging for it to be made mandatory for the rest of us. So, starting from this point with all of that damage that's been done over a century, it's really difficult. But I support what Preston Manning's doing. That initiative, I think, is good. It will help. But really, I think the person who influenced me most in my philosophy, going back to the time that I was about 18 years old, was Ayn Rand. I read Ayn Rand's book, Atlas Shrugged, and it was sort of like, oh my goodness. And she always said, we need a philosophical revolution before we can have a political revolution. So she never got involved in political parties. She said, I'm sticking to trying to make people understand what's wrong with collectivism. And that's always been my position as well, which is why I write. I try to make people understand, but God, it's an uphill battle.
Who is John Galt? That book is on our reading list. By the way, when we come to the end, we're going to ask you for a couple of suggestions. So feel free to suggest Ayn Rand. Although I think both of her novels are already on our reading list. They're both great.
I didn't know you had a list. Okay.
Oh well, there you go. See, I'm putting you on notice. Okay. You could just refer people to stuff that you've written if you like. That's
no.
Totally fine.
I mean, it's I really need to revise my website, but I do have a website that's just my name, KarenSelick.com, with all of the stuff that I wrote. Starting from about 1989 to, I don't know.
Yeah, there's a lot of it. There's a lot.
And then I stopped posting it because, it was kept online by the various publications I wrote.
So I want to come back to this idea of what people are seeing, what they're learning, and public hysteria. You talked about masking. Now, you've also written, one of the other topics you've written about is censorship. You expressed concern. One of your pieces is censorship, which is more demeaning than pornography. That's a very thought-provoking title. What did you mean by that? Can you remember?
I wish you could point me to the article.
I think the essence of it is that censorship is demeaning because it treats people like they're idiots. right? That the government has to tell people what is appropriate or not appropriate for them to see, because we're too stupid, we're too simple, we're too indolent to separate out what is good information from bad information, what is edifying from what is not. And I think the point of your piece, as I read it, that's even worse than pornography, because I mean, at least when people look at pornography, they know what they're seeing. They're able to make a decision about what they're looking at, and they can decide whether or not to look at it. But what's so insidious about censorship is we don't know what we're not seeing. And so you said that censorship in that sense is worse than pornography. Would you agree with that? I mean, that's the kind of the sense that I had from your piece.
I think I need to recycle some of these articles. I was just thinking that today when I look back at some of the ones that I had written earlier. I thought, I don't even remember writing that, but wow. I've got to recycle that and just update it a little bit and put it out again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very appreciate, because of course censorship is something that is very much in the news in Canada right now, of course. And what's really concerning to me is the advent of social media and the extent of unabashed government control over what's being done in social media. I mean, we've seen governments in Canada and the United States actually direct social media to do certain things. Take, for example, the removal or the suspension of Donald Trump from Twitter.
Yeah.
That was essentially done at the direction of that was essentially done at the direction of the Biden White House.
Yeah. And the suppression of Hunter Biden's laptop contents.
Right, exactly. And this goes on. I mean, hopefully this is going to change, but it seems to me that the censorship issue is one that is not talked about enough, and it's certainly connected to the federal government's championing and really taking over of the mass media in Canada, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, right. There are places that used to publish me. I used to be published regularly in the National Post. And now, even before the pandemic, they had sort of stopped publishing me because I've been very critical of mainstream medicine for a long time and pharmaceutical companies, even before vaccinations started. So I think that was the main reason why they didn't want to publish anything to do with that. And that was my area of interest at the time. But there's some places that I used to be published that I don't bother to submit to anymore because I know that they won't publish it. So I get that they've been paid. They know which side of it is buttered on.
So Karen, as a self-professed libertarian thinker, what is the antidote? What can we as Canadians do, individual Canadians do, to sort of combat or oppose the sort of woke takeover that seems to be in all of our institutions? How do we take this back? How do we sort of walk out what Ayn Rand wrote about in Atlas Shrugged?
I don't have any solutions, I'm afraid. I'm not feeling optimistic these days.
Mm-hmm.
The one thing I have noticed throughout all this is that there were certain Christian denominations that stood up, but it wasn't the mainstream Christian churches. So, the Catholics didn't stand up. And this is mostly the evangelical churches, the small evangelical churches that stood up. And ordinarily, I don't consider myself to have a lot in common with them. But as it turned out, on the issue of freedom of thought and freedom of expression and freedom of association, it turns out that I do. Whether that sort of temporary coalition is going to start falling apart again once things ease up, that could well happen.
Mm-hmm. There certainly is a lot of evidence of progressivism within the Christian church. Probably the best example is is the current Pope. And some of the things that some of the causes that he supports seems to be very much aligned with the World Economic Forum and with UN Agenda 2030, for example. This I'm always interested to know when I have people like you on the show who are sort of let's say right of center in their thinking. about, what can we do? What practical solutions are there? But I suppose the real answer is to do what you're doing, and that is to continue to write for as long as you can, and to create awareness among the populace that there is another way to look at these issues, and this broad government mass media narrative really is not correct, and it really is destructive of human liberty and prosperity. I suppose maybe that's the best advice that those of us who don't subscribe to it could give, right?
And as I say, you have to be bold about it. You have to be willing to say, this is what I believe, because you do find that peer pressure of both varieties works. So if everybody is saying one thing and nobody's taking the opposite view, there have been studies, some really interesting psychological studies on this, where people in a room where they are the only one saying something different, they start to shut up, even though it's like the other people are saying something blatantly false about, the length of two lines on a screen. People are saying, no, they're equal. And with your own eyes that they're not equal. But nobody will say anything if he's the only one in the room. But when one other person says, even if you have 50 people saying, they're the same, and one person says, no, I think they're different, then the experimental subject will also say, I think they're different. So it is really important to speak up and be heard as much as possible.
That sounds an awful lot like that scene in Orwell's 1984 when they're talking about 2 + 2 equals 4, right? Anyway, Karen, it's been a real pleasure chatting with you today. This is the part of our program where we turn to something called the reading list, which I foreshadowed. I'm going to go ahead with a couple of my selections, and then maybe you can give us a couple of your own, if you can think of some, or a website or something that you think would be edifying for the people taking in this podcast. I've chosen, I'm a big fan of the late Dr. Roger Scruton, his work, and so I've chosen a couple of his books, which are in line with some of the topics that we've been talking about today. The first one is called Political Philosophy, Arguments for Conservatism. And the description here is that over the past 20 years, Dr. Scruton had been developing a conservative view of human beings, society, and culture. The tone of this book is positive, and the arguments are recommendations with the aim of convincing the reader that rumors of the death of Western civilization are greatly exaggerated. Much of our present self-doubt, argues Scruton, is brought about by the Darwinian theory of evolution. Darwin encourages us to see human emotion as a reproductive strategy. This is a perspective which Scruton attacked vehemently, especially in its modern proponents, Desmond Morris and Richard Dawkins. This, the author believes, undermines the belief in freedom and the moral imperatives that stem from it. The other one is a book where Dr. Scruton looks very hard at the thinkers of the left. And this is called Fools, Frauds, and Firebrands, Thinkers of the Left. Description here, thinkers who have been most influential on the attitudes of the new left, which we've been talking about today with Karen, are examined in the study by one of the leading critics of leftist orientations in modern Western civilization. Dr. Scruton begins with a ruthless analysis of new leftism and concludes with a critique of the key strands in its thinking. He conducts a reappraisal of such major left-wing thinkers as E.P. Thompson, Ronald Dworkin, R.D. Laing, Jürgen Habermas, Georgi Lukács, Jean-Paul Sartre, Jacques Derrida, Slavoj Zizek, Ralph Miliband, and Eric Hobsbawm. In addition to assessments of these thinkers' philosophical and political contributions, the book contains a biographical section summarizing their careers and most important writings. In this book, Scruton asks, what does the left look like today as it has evolved since 1989, when the wall came down? He charts the transfer of grievances from the working class to women, gays, and immigrants, asks what can we put in the place of radical egalitarianism, and what explains the continued dominance of attitudes in the intellectual world, or antinomian attitudes in the intellectual world. Can there be any foundation for resistance to the leftist agenda without religious faith, which is one of the questions we're talking about today. So Karen, those are my selections. Are there any that you could share with the people taking in this podcast today?
I love talking about books. So I guess I would say just from the get-go, the authors, if you've never read anything by Ayn Rand, like, you've got to.
Yes.
And then as far as free market economics goes, my choice would be Murray Rothbard. He wrote a whole lot of stuff. But as far as some specific things to read, one that I made a little video about at the beginning of the pandemic, a little known work by an author named Ira Levin. It's a novel. And Ira Levin has some very famous books like, Boys from Brazil and Rosemary's Baby, which is one that I haven't read. But some of his books are just great. And the one that I want to talk about here is This Perfect Day, because it's a dystopian novel about a place where everybody has to get vaccinated once a month.
Really?
Yes. I don't remember what year it was written, probably 1960, 1970, somewhere around there. But it's a really great dystopian novel about, compulsory vaccinations and also compulsory death. So everybody died at roughly 60 years old, but it was because of what we were given in your shot that month. So when you reached your 60th birthday, they would sort of start to, fiddle with the contents of your monthly vaccine. And funny, nobody never lived beyond 61. So it's a good piece of fiction if you want to read it, and very, certainly foreshadowed what we're having now. Then, not on political philosophy, but on some other interesting stuff that I've been reading. There's a book that I'd like to recommend to everybody called The Moth in the Iron Lung. And it's about, the subtitle is A Biography of Polio by an author named Forrest, Forrest, Moretti, Maready. Great book because it discusses the possibility that the epidemics of paralytic polio in the 1950s, the horrible thing that everybody feared before we had a vaccine in about 56 or so, was actually aggravated by pesticides. So there's lots of work on this on the internet, but you can see graphs showing the use of lead arsenate from about the 1890s and DDT, all to deal with gypsy moths. We had an infestation of gypsy moths that started in this continent in about 1890 accidentally, and gypsy moths have no natural predators. And they strip all the foliage off everything. And to prevent the destruction of all the foliage in North America, people started using lead arsenate, which is a spray. And of course, both lead and arsenic are really bad for people to ingest. And people were poisoned, by this, and it poisoned them in a particular way that it appeared to be polio. So people were getting paralyzed by this. It was attributed to polio, and it's just a really fascinating story. If you have any doubts about the polio vaccine history, which I already doubted before I saw this book come out, one and another really interesting sort of paradigm shifting book that I recommend to people is called The Invisible Rainbow, and I think the subtitle is A History of Electricity and the Human Health or something, by a guy named Arthur Furstenberg. And right from the beginning of the pandemic, a lot of people were saying it's not really a virus that's causing all these symptoms. It's electromagnetic radiation, 5G in particular. And I think there is something to that theory. And if you read that book, you may come to believe that there really is something to that theory too.
Wow. Karen, that's just wonderful. We've got, I think I counted 5 or 6 books you've added to our reading list, which is just wonderful. By the way, for those who don't know, the full reading list is set out on our webpage. And so feel free to go on there and check it out. I don't know how many books we're at, but gosh, we must be well over 100 now. Devin could probably tell us. Anyway, Karen, this has been a real pleasure speaking with you.
Yeah,
I want to thank you so much for your time and sharing your ideas with here today on Gray Matter. And also want to give out a special thanks to the good people at the Frontier Center for Public Policy for putting us in touch with you. Because if it weren't for them, we never would have met you, and we wouldn't have had the opportunity to share you with our audience. So thanks very much for being our special guest today, Karen.
You're welcome. It's my pleasure.
Okay, thank you.